European Union leaders are planning a massive increase in defense spending worth hundreds of billions of euros. The aim is to dramatically boost defense capabilities by the year 2030 in the face of a growing threat posed by Russia. In a paper presented ahead of the summit, the European Commission warned that history would not forgive leaders for failing to act. Plans include 150 billion euros in European Union loans for defense investments and an exemption from EU debt rules for defense spending. As well as fears that Moscow may attack an EU nation in the coming years, there are also doubts about the future of U.S. protection for Europe via NATO. Here's the EU foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas.
The problem with defense is that if we invest enough in defense, if we build our capabilities, then it will also deter aggressors to attack us. If we don't do that, weakness invites aggressor to attack. So that's why we need to do more in order for this not to happen.
Joining me now is Nathalie Tocci. She's director of the Institute of International Affairs in Rome. She is also one of the authors of an article which appeared earlier this year in Foreign Affairs entitled, "Can American Abandonment Help Europe?" Nathalie, it's good to have you on the program. I want to ask you, with EU leaders meeting right now in Brussels, will they be able to say with one voice, yes, we are being abandoned by the United States as a guarantor of our security?
Well, I'm not sure that all EU leaders will be able to say it, and I'm not sure that the Europe that will be born out of this double threat, on the one hand, obviously, and first and foremost, Russia's threat, starting with Ukraine but not ending with Ukraine, and on the other hand, not just the threat of being abandoned by the US, but the threat of the United States in cahoots with Russia. Mm-hmm. So that, to me, is, in a sense, really what is different about this moment. So I'm not sure that all EU member states will be on the same page with this reading, but I do think that there is a critical mass of European countries, and I deliberately say European countries because I don't think that all of them are members of the European Union. Think about the United Kingdom, think about Norway, for example. I do think that there is a critical mass of European countries that get the severity of the threat, and therefore will actually do what is necessary to ensure that Europe as a whole will actually remain secure.
You know, this meeting today, it's the first time that EU leaders have met since Putin and Trump spoke on the phone about a ceasefire in Ukraine. It is also German Chancellor Olaf Scholz's last EU meeting as Germany's leader. He brings with him an unprecedented plan to increase defense spending in Germany. Is this the correct response to American abandonment, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, it's definitely part of the correct response. I mean, it is very clear that if Europe as a whole is to face Russia alone without the United States, there will need to be very significant amounts of defense spending that will need to fill the gap that has been left from, 30 years of progressive disarmament in Europe. So it's definitely a major part of the response. Now, is it the only part of the response? No. It is very clear that what needs to happen is not just for national budgets to increase, but for national budgets and an EU budget or EU loans, in a sense, or EU grants to be there to induce that a lot of the spending should not just happen within European countries, but between European countries in the construction of shared European capacities for defense.
Yeah. Now, you write that conditioning EU funding on the dominant political party's respect for the rule of law cannot ensure that democracy prevails here in Europe. That said, would you advise the EU to make all defense expenditures contingent on that respect, on respecting the rule of law?
Well, look, I actually think that this is an extremely important point, and it speaks to a broader question, I think. Why is it that we need to do more on defense? Why is it that our security, our defense is important? What is it that we are actually defending? If there isn't clarity about what it is that we're defending, actually, this could end up being very dangerous and not just difficult conversation. What I mean by this is that the reason why we have to be more capable on defense is because we are defending our liberal democracies, right? Our European integration. If there isn't clarity about this, then we may as well just get occupied by Russia or occupied by the United States.
Nathalie,
so I actually think that... Sorry.
If I could, let me just ask you, what happens then when a major EU member country elects a new government that does not want more military spending? I'm thinking of maybe the Alternative for Germany party here in Germany, for example. Doesn't that torpedo Europe's attempt at independence from the United States?
Well, yes, but I think it torpedoes much more than that, yeah? In fact, if I were to flip that question around, I would actually be terrified of a Germany led by the Alternative for Deutschland, which actually wants to spend a lot on defense, because you'd be asking yourself, what exactly would they be spending on? This is why I think it's very important to retain the connection between, on the one hand, yes, defense, but on the other hand, clarity on the principles of liberal democracies that we're out there to defend.
You write that Europe must increase its defense industrial production in order to reduce its dependence on the U.S. The U.S., as we know, remains the military industrial factory for Europe. Would you agree that this is now maybe an unhealthy codependence? I'm wondering what happens when orders from Europe are canceled or don't happen. What kind of reaction do you expect to come from the United States?
Okay, so I actually think it's important to break this down into different categories. There are some things that we lack or that we don't have enough of, which we can continue to buy from the United States or indeed from others. You take, for example, the case of ammunition, right? I mean, once you buy ammunition, it's yours, and there's nothing that can be done to make it less yours. Then there are other capacities, let's say tanks, for example. You buy them, they're yours, but, you still need a little bit of cooperation because you may need some maintenance, you may need some spare parts, for example. Those issues, I think, this is, in a sense, a gray zone. And then there are other areas still, like Patriot systems, or like satellites, Starlink, in which you buy something, but it's never 100% yours, right? It's never actually yours. Now, we don't quite know whether, for instance, on an F-35, there is the famous kill switch, right? But on those capacities where actually there are technological reasons, right, that explain why something is never fully yours, well, on those capacities, the weaning off will not be overnight, but I think we really, and now really is a time to rethink exactly whether we should be buying them from others or whether we should be producing more of this stuff on our own.
Nathalie Tocci, we appreciate your time and your valuable insights tonight. Fascinating discussion. Please come back again. Thank you.
Great talking to you. Thank you.
DW's Brussels correspondent Rosie Birchard is covering the EU leaders' meeting, and she joins us now. Rosie, the EU leaders have committed to significantly increase defence spending. Can you bring us up to speed on what's been going on there?
Absolutely. A next political step at this summit in the EU's bid to beef up its military might. So what we've seen is a step forward in a plan to mobilise up to 800 billion euros. That's around about 870 billion US dollars in additional defence spending, including through easing fiscal rules to give EU member states more flexibility in their spending over the next few years. Now, while there are still some small disagreements about the exact details of how this should proceed, overall member states seem to be on the same page that they need to ramp up their defence spending and that the era of low defence spending in Europe is over. What has been slightly more contentious is the topic of radically boosting military support to Ukraine. While 26 out of the 27 EU countries signed up to a statement pledging to double down on that aid to Ukraine and rejecting President Putin's demands, which they really see as amounting to a request that Ukraine capitulates, there was one member state which didn't sign up, that was Hungary. It's very much seen as a critic of EU aid to Ukraine. So we see on the one hand here the fact that the EU can still, 26 out of 27, move forward. when it comes to things like military aid, which is very much in national government's control. But we've also seen the limits, because if Hungary blocks other hopes for Ukraine, including its hope to one day join this European Union, that's simply not something they can get around. You need unanimity for that to be able to move forward. So likely more debates teed up for here over the next few months, and indeed could be years.
And still on Ukraine, there's the issue of the ceasefire, potential ceasefire deal that US President Donald Trump is pushing for. Is there concern that the EU is being sidelined in this diplomacy?
You bet there is. Europe has been calling for a seat at the table ever since President Trump was first seen as making those overtures to President Vladimir Putin. And I spoke to Belgium's Prime Minister after these talks, and he was quite frank. He said there are some EU member states who hope that Trump will see that President Putin is not trustworthy and come back more to a European perspective, but there are other EU member states, particularly, he said, those which know Russia best. You can assume he's alluding to, for example, Poland and the Baltic states, who really fear that Trump might agree to some of Putin's demands. And with that, Europe is really racing to try and make sure that it has a say, as the future of the security of this continent could be being decided over its head. We've heard from some EU leaders here saying essentially they feel that peace negotiations are not really yet underway, that these are more talks about talks. However, the fact is, whatever is going on, they do not have a seat at that table. The drive to get there continues. We've just heard that French President Emmanuel Macron, 1 week from now, will host leaders of a so-called coalition of the willing, countries which may be willing to back up an eventual peace deal in Ukraine at some point down the line with potentially military boots on the ground. He will host that meeting in 1 week, so save the date. So far, that any sort of peace deal is, of course, just an idea, because on the battleground, Russia continues very much to wage war.
OK, we'll leave it there for now. DW's Brussels correspondent Rosie Birchard, thank you for that update.
Jacob von Kirkegaard is a senior fellow at Bruegel. That's a Brussels-based economic think tank. He's also a non-resident senior fellow with the Peterson Institute for International Economics. So welcome to DW. So Europe now looking at borrowing billions to plough into this 150 billion euro rearmament fund. What do you see as being the most urgent priorities?
Well, I think Kaja Kallas really said it very clearly. The urgent priority is, quite frankly, whatever Ukraine needs today and tomorrow. That means artillery ammunition. It means, I believe, the financial funding that Ukraine needs to actually fully utilize its own domestic military production capacity, because that is the cheapest place to purchase or to produce what the country needs at the moment. So this is really an issue on which we need to listen to the people doing the fighting, namely the Ukrainians, and that will set our priorities.
OK, so short term, Ukraine, but presumably Europe has to look to the medium and long term as it looks at a future with Russia potentially looking to gain more territory and the United States apparently prepared to look the other way.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's no doubt that, defense planning in the European Union and beyond in Europe has to now be on the basis that there is no U.S. security guarantee going forward, that we cannot rely on the U.S. security guarantee. In that sense, we're all Gaullists now, I suppose. But what that means, again, is that we need to prepare for a potential prolonged defensive war against an aggressive Russia. That in turn means we need to look at, and this is, I guess it's fair to say, still being written on the battlefield, we need to see what actually works on the battlefield in Ukraine, and then we got to buy a lot of it. That certainly means an awful lot of drones. It certainly means what we already talked about, a lot of artillery ammunition. It means probably also more medium-range missiles, European independent intelligence gathering capabilities. It is a very long list potentially. But again, as I said, the key for what's actually on it is what works on the battlefield.
OK. And so how does Europe... It's one thing to sort of say, now we have a lot of money, but rearmament, army procurement is notoriously slow. So how do these 27 individual countries accelerate the rearmament process?
Well, I mean, the unfortunate fact is that we would like common procurement at the European level. That is not going to happen because defense spending remains with member states. And there, the big problem is that as big a threat as Russia is, it is a threat that is obviously more urgently felt in the Baltic countries, in Poland and other neighboring countries to Russia. It is, at the end of the day, less felt on the Iberian Peninsula, for instance. There, they also have other security concerns. And therefore, the biggest challenge when it comes to spending the money is to find the common projects that all can agree on. This might be air defense. It might be things like sea drones for the, to use to survey and protect undersea cables and pipelines and those types of things. But fundamentally, we need to find a way to come to an agreement about what our true common strategic defense needs are. That's something we have failed to do to date, but hopefully soon.
Thanks for guiding us through that so clearly. Economist Jacob von Kirkegaard from Bruegel and the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Well, with growing uneasiness over changes in U.S. foreign policy, some countries are reviewing their dependence on the U.S. military sector. That includes Canada, which is reconsidering an order of F-35 fighter jets. But getting out of these deals, it doesn't happen easily or quickly.
The F-35 Lightning II, here as part of the Norwegian Armed Forces. Of all military equipment, fighter jets are among the most sophisticated and the most expensive. An F-35's price tag starts at $80 million. That's because they're not just used to drop bombs and missiles. Modern fighter jets carry surveillance and intelligence software and can even interfere with enemy communications. Procuring them takes years, with ramifications for decades to come.
Today, the Finnish government decided to procure 64 Lockheed Martin F-35A multirole fighters. F-35 will replace the Finnish Air Force current Hornet fleet by the end of the decade. It will define the Finnish Air Force's combat capability into the 2060s.
Across Europe, 13 countries have placed orders for the F-35, and the planes are already being operated in several of them. When current orders have been delivered, more than 570 F-35s will be stationed in Europe, making them a key component of the continent's air defenses. But with growing uneasiness over recent turns in U.S. foreign policy, some allies are starting to review their orders. For instance, Europe's key ally Canada has been hit hard by the Trump administration's actions. Canada has a pending order for 88 F-35s.
With me, we had a discussion about Canada's options, and the fact is that under the contract, as you may know, after a certain number of purchases, then we have options on subsequent aircrafts.
Canada is not alone in these considerations. Earlier, Portugal's defense minister said that his country would backtrack plans to buy F-35s. French President Emmanuel Macron has been especially vocal about ramping up arms production in Europe.
Our country and our continent must continue to defend themselves, to equip themselves, and to prepare themselves if we are to avoid war.
French Rafale fighters, as seen here, as well as the Eurofighter, are European alternatives for American-made F-35s. And the Swedish-built Gripen II is on Canada's shortlist as an F-35 alternative. They all, however, have some US equipment built into them. Since procurement contracts for military aircraft are often made for decades, many of the countries with orders for the F-35s know there is no getting out of using them. Some analysts are also increasingly worried about another rumored feature of the F-35, the so-called kill switch.
When you buy an F-35, you can see your F-35 stuck to the ground if Mr. Trump says no, I forbid you to fight against Russian planes. You must be aware of the danger.
The switch would supposedly enable the Pentagon to remotely disable foreign-operated F-35s. No evidence of this feature has been provided. Manufacturer Lockheed Martin, however, maintains that international F-35 operators cannot conduct independent test operations of the jets outside of the US and keeps control over the jet's key software.